Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Asia Art Archive. My name is Ingrid Chu. I'm the Public Programs Curator here at AAA. And it's great to see a full house here this afternoon. So I just wanted to sort of do a quick rundown of the program today. And you are here to welcome Joan Kee in conversation with my colleague, Michelle Wong. So we'll have our talk by Joan for around 40-45 minutes, and then about a 10 to 15 minute conversation between Joan and Michelle, and then we will have a few quick questions, and then we'll break more into sort of a casual conversation, and if you'd like more questions, over lunch. So with that, I just wanted to give a quick introduction to Asia Art Archive. I know that many of you are very well versed in what we do and our activities here. But as you know, we are 15 years old, I think quickly going on to 16 soon. And we've built out the very large collection of recent art in Asia. And it's growing now more and more onto the digital sphere. And so, of course, you're welcome to come and look at our resources, and also to tell all your friends and your colleagues about all the materials that we have to enable them also to utilize what we have, and hopefully to spread the word of all of the great material and work and writings and art that's happening here and beyond. So with that, I just wanted to give a quick introduction to Joan Kee, who is an associate professor in the history of art at the University of Michigan. She specializes in modern and contemporary art, contributes to Art Forum as an editor, and has written on many, many different subjects. Many of you, I'm sure, have read already, and she's here to sort of speak more to her current research. Some of her essays have been on the Gutai, on Anish Kapoor, on Kawara, Liu Fan, among many, many others. And her book on post-war Korean art, Contemporary Korean Art, Tansakwa, and the Urgency of Method, from Minnesota Press in 2013, was the finalist at the College Art Association for an outstanding book in the history of art, and as she rightly mentioned, I think the first on any form of art writing in Asia. So with that, and quickly, of course, you probably already know my colleague Michelle Wong, who's our researcher here, and upcoming participant in the curatorial team of the Gwangju Biennale, so of course, a great person to be able to converse with Joan on the art of Korea. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Joan. Thank you again.
Great. Thank you so much, Ingrid, for your lovely introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be here in Hong Kong. I used to live here 15 years ago when we did not have such a vibrant community for contemporary art. Something quite different back then. Just a few quick words, opening words about the title. So it says Art in Korea, and obviously Korea is a divided peninsula. I will speak mostly about art in South Korea. 1953 to 1995. The years are fairly specific as to seem almost arbitrary. I can assure you that they're not. 1953 refers to the provisional end of the Korean War. And I say provisional because officially the two Koreas are still at war, as Kim Jong-un likes to remind us on an hourly basis. And 1995, I was a little bit... I was having a little bit of an argument with myself of whether 1995 or 1992 should be the end point. 95 is when the Gwangju Biennale was first established. It was the first kind of marker of Korea's kind of entrance into a newly formed international community based on the idea of the biennial. So those big, massive, large-scale recurring events. The other end point that I also had in mind was 1992. That is the year when Korea had its first democratically elected president in a very, very long time. So just keeping these kind of years, endpoints in mind, they're of course not fixed and necessarily fixed, but it does open up larger questions about modernity and the contemporary, how we should periodize these concepts, and what does it mean to historicize this kind of art. Now, one other note to make about realisms is that, so realism is a word that really didn't come into kind of the Korean artistic lexicon until the 1950s. When realism was first talked about in relationship to art, it was in the early 1930s, mostly in connection with either literature or surrealism. So it's a fairly kind of recent phrase, and I take a little bit of liberty with this because I also talk a lot about questions of reality. So usually when realism is discussed in Korea, it usually means some kind of engagement with reality, however defined that might be. Let's see. One of those some of the earliest debates over the idea of realism was the concept of a new reality. And this is what new reality meant was it was really about a kind of depiction that takes place before truth is generated. Now that's a direct quote from a critic who was writing about this work at that particular time. This is a work by Kwon Young-woo. Some of you may be familiar with him as a Tansekwa artist. This is what he did before that. This is a work called After the Bombing. It's from 1957. So again, 4 years after the kind of the temporary hiatus of the Korean War. It's an ink on paper work, and this is also something I just wanted to call your attention to. When we think about contemporary art, ink painting kind of is sort of has sort of a marginalized place. But in Korea, until as late as the 1960s, it was considered part of the avant-garde. And so many of the most prominent works that tended to get displayed, say in the 1950s or early 60s, tended to be ink paintings. And so the work that you see here, this is a work that it's really about, say, fragmentation. So we see kind of these bent railroad tracks. We see sort of these the remnants of traces of war. And this is a work that really concerns it's kind of the severing of directions. This is sort of a non-place in a way. It's a very different work than, say, Kwon Young-woo's classmate, Lee Jong-sang, another ink painting called Work by 1962. It's a very, very large work. It's 2.7 by 3.2 meters. So the work that you see on the right, it was actually heavily criticized by critics at the time, despite winning the grand prize at the annual National Government Salon, which was at this time the most important venue for contemporary art in Korea. Is that lots of critics criticize this, saying this kind of goes for the low-hanging fruit. It's a little bit too easy. You know, what can be more sort of obvious than having a large painting filled with workers? But the other criticism that this particular work drew was that its points of reference were really propaganda painting, and propaganda painting of the type that existed before 1945. So, basic primer on Korean history, 1910 to 1945, Korea was occupied by Japan, was annexed as a colony. And in the late 1940s, lots of Korean artists, not Lee Jong-sung, but some of his teachers, were impressed into the service of the imperial state to make propaganda paintings. That was one point of reference. Another was socialist realism. So many of you might think, it looks kind of like Shu Bei-hong. You would be on the right track in that regard. Socialist realism was very popular among a subset of colonial-era artists and critics, many of whom were Marxist, many of whom were very interested in proletariat art, and most of whom ended up going to North Korea after 1945. So lots of critics were a little bit put off by the work on the right, because for them it felt very on the surface rather than this idea of a fleshed out new reality that was heavily endorsed at this particular time. Now, one of the reasons why I'm bringing up the Kwon Young-woo work on the left, and this also brings forth a larger question about judgment, something that we'll talk about more in a little bit, is the work on the right it's really about, say, what happens when the world doesn't make sense. So this is really at the heart of what one might consider realism. So in other words, it's kind of stubborn, it's sort of everything is sort of awkward, the composition is a little off, you don't have a real sort of separation between foreground and background, and the work on the left. And in many ways, when you think about realism, or the ways in which artworks in Korea were thinking about, or envisioning realism is that it's really about, say, these moments of antagonism, of uncertainty, of anxiety, where connections don't quite come together. So one of the larger questions that I wanted to kind of get at in this particular talk is these connections. So however unpleasant or toxic or unresolved they might be, do they actually lay the groundwork for a more genuine form of social interaction than, say, some other forms of approaches to depiction that have taken in the past, especially forms of depiction that are endorsed by institutions. One is the state. The second would be, say, the international art world. So one way to kind of think about this is, how do these kinds of works set up an alternative form of thinking about how do we relate in the world? Now, on that note, it's probably not surprising that the first kind of real theorizations of realism actually takes place in photography. Photography in Korea was not considered a bona fide visual art form until well into the 1960s. And so one way to also think about photography is that the point of reference that it's making, so unlike the Kwon Young-woo or Lee Jung-sung work that we just saw, is that their point of reference is not the artistic community. It's not the critics. It's not, say, other artists, but it is really about just everyday life, everyday people. Most photographers, really until about the mid-1960s, when a separate institution for the study of photography was established, they're all coming from either journalism or some kind of commercial background. And the erstwhile father of realism is Lee Mung-sik. And these are just some of his works. Probably his best known one is the work on the center called Looking for Work, where you see a very forlorn young man leaning against a reflective large marble building, and he has a wooden placard around his throat, and literally says looking for work. I've paired it with another photograph that he took around the same time called Homeless Geese. And that particular work, so you have the geese in the foreground, and then you have what looks like to be a development in the background. Now, what that particular work depicts is the displacement of, say, not just people, but of animals that took place in the immediate wake of the Korean War, when you had, say, massive reconstruction projects, many of which were funded by the U.S. government. I've also chosen to show homeless geese because one of the concerns that Lee Mung-sik was very much interested in is that even though in, say, histories of mainstream Korean art, he's celebrated as a humanist. This is a guy who was very much involved in bringing the family of man photography show to Korea. Is that he was really interested in thinking about alternative viewpoints. So it's not just the viewpoint of the individual or the human that matters. What about the animals? What about the environment? What happens to the environment in the name of, say, redevelopment that is really only geared towards, say, a particular kind or particular idea of progress? On the lower right-hand corner, we have another photograph. It's from 1956, very simply titled Women. Now, what's another kind of hallmark of Lee Mung-sik's photography is that many of them have no particular focal point. So here what you have is one woman that is kind of walking in one direction and a group of women who are sort of lingering in the street on the other side. The space. So another real consideration for Lee Mung-sik was, how do I think about, say, proximity and distance, especially when you're dealing with a world that is kind of imposing proximity onto you. So you have lots of people coming into Seoul, the capital city of Korea, but does that kind of forced proximity actually translate into any kind of real intimacy? And Lee Mung-sik was very critical of this kind of this larger divide. Another prominent photographer in, say, the early to late 1950s was Kim Han-young. Two works that you see here. Kim Han-young was the first commercial photographer in Korea, and by that I mean someone who really pioneered advertising photography, although both of these particular images were not produced in that capacity. So on the left we have Kim Han-young imaged called Namsan Seoul. So it's kind of one of the usual sorts of wedding photographs that were popular. But what's interesting about this photograph is you see that the ostensible main subject, so the married couple right here. the married couple right here, is it's not the center. It's this larger statue of the president at the time, Lee Seung-man, who was later toppled in a popular coup d'etat in 1960. And so you start to kind of get an idea of, you start to really think about, okay, so if reality is kind of the subject, what is sort of determining that reality, right? On the right is another Kim Han-young photograph. So it's an untitled depiction of various men in different different ages and groups, and they're all looking through one of those sorts of those portable viewfinders, which is something that was quite popular as sort of a activity of leisure. Now, I'm bringing up this particular image here because another interest that Kim Han-young had was this idea of looking and being looked at. So we're talking about the 1950s. Yes, it was an age of surveillance, but Kim Han-young was also really interested in how did people use the tools or means at their disposal to look back on those who were looking at them. In terms of, say, realism in photography, this kind of really comes to the fore in the mid-1960s. So this is after photography becomes sort of accepted as a bona fide art category for visual art. These are two images by a photographer named Jun Min-cho. Jun Min-cho came to photography when he was a student in sociology. So his background is markedly different from many of the other photographers who emerged at this time. He later became a journalist for the 중앙일보, but he didn't start out as a photojournalist. He started out as a reporter for social affairs, or current events rather, and came to photography really almost as an amateur. So he's unlike Kim Han-young or Lee Seung-sik, who come to photography by working near the U.S. Military base, for example, or by working for taking pictures for newspapers as freelancers. Jun Min-cho is coming from a very sort of different background. And the series that he took, the one that kind of really sort of solidified his position was a series called Holt Orphanage. Many of you might be familiar with Korea as, I guess pejoratively speaking, Korea has sometimes been known as an exporter of babies. This happened a lot in the 1960s and 70s. The Holt Orphanage was sort of the center for that, where children, usually children of unwed mothers and mixed race children, were kind of left to basically fend for themselves or await adoption by parents in Western countries. Now, the series was, these are just two examples. The series itself was comprised of about 95 works or so out of over 3,000 images that he had taken of mixed race children that were left in these orphanages. Almost all of them are the children of Korean mothers and U.S. military servicemen, so temporary liaisons. And these photographs were shown in downtown Seoul at the Central Information Gallery. That's a venue that's run by the state, and it got, of course, widespread attention. But one of the reasons I'm bringing up this series is because you start to have photographers thinking about realism as what kind of light, or how can we illuminate the margins of society? So in the mid-1960s, you have President Park Chung-hee, the father of the current president of South Korea, really about this idea of the unified nation, about the racial purity, racial unity, and to have these kinds of photographs just shown over and over again, and not necessarily as purely as documentary images. So another sort of quirk about the Holt Orphanage series is that you see a lot of these kinds of magnified portraits, that you just don't see children kind of huddled together en masse and under blankets as you might see in a newspaper. You have the photographer really trying to get viewers to think about these particular children as individuals of their own. One of the statements that he wrote with regard to the series was, they have no kin, no life, and of course no feelings. All they have is the fate laid out for them by the color of their skin. And so this is, again, something that really sort of struck a uncomfortable chord again in a country that even today multiculturalism is something that is really kind of approached through kind of with white gloves. Another series that he did, which I thought might have particular relevance in this context, is a series called The Chinese of Incheon. It's from 1968. And the images that you see here, so they're taken from a fairly large group. These are all the descendants of Qing merchants that came to Korea in the late 19th century after Korea was forcibly opened by foreign powers. And what happened, say, to the descendants was, okay, so 1910, the Qing falls. They still have citizenship of the as Republican Chinese. But after 1949, so after Mao Zedong's victory, the descendants that are left in Korea essentially become stateless. They also become propertyless because after 1953, there is a massive land reform that the president of Korea undertakes. And so what happens is that these are all basically people who really literally have nowhere to go. They have no passport, they have no citizenship, they have no property. And even today, these diasporic Chinese living in Incheon, which is again very close to the airport, for those of you who've been to Korea, is this is a subsector of, say, the Korean population that really just is kind of just swept almost under the rug. And you can see a little bit of how that's invoked, say, through these photographs, especially through the distance between where you're kind of imagined to be standing versus where sort of the people are standing. They're all standing in transitional spaces, on thresholds, on stairways. They're not kind of, their bodies are not kind of fully out into the open. And this is a very sort of awkward space. It's neither a space that connotes some sort of neighborliness or friendliness, but it's also not completely estranged as well. So again, one of the other themes that we've been talking about is this interplay between proximity and distance, but the Chinese of Incheon series is really kind of puts it to the fore. Another photographer that was very much implicated in this, what might be called a larger project of realism, was Jun Min-cho. Now, Jun Min-cho was among the first generation of Korean photographers to be formally trained in photography. So he actually goes to the Sorobol College of Arts. It's the first university in Korea to have a standalone photography department. And in some ways, I wanted to call this talk "Dead Dog on the Ground" because he has taken many, many photographs of dead animals on the ground. He has a particular fascination with the ground, and in many ways, the ground serves as a counterpoint to that kind of insistent verticality that was very much part of the Korean built environment. Lots of skyscrapers. Park Chung-hee loved height. Again, when you're short, height is all you think about. Elevated highways, tall skyscrapers, tall buildings, but Jun Min-cho, by this kind of reversal in a way, he really took a lot of pictures of sort of the street. What happens at street level? What happens when you're not constantly looking up? And so this is probably one of the more kind of compelling of that suite of photographs. And this is also sort of another trademark of his, that the way that it's cropped, for example. So one of the real sort of priorities of a lot of Korean photographers was to think about the point at which something becomes visible or not visible. So you might think to yourself, that is kind of a miscropping, but this is actually very, very deliberate, that he wanted to show, say, just the feet of passerby, not necessarily the faces, but again, to emphasize that idea of being, say, grounded, of being, say, in a particular place. Another photographer who, again, was part of that generation of photographers who were formally trained in the technique was Jun Min-cho. This is a photograph called Apgujeong. Apgujeong, as you know, is the epicenter of the so-called and much maligned Gangnam Style. Where the man is tilling his fields, that is where the Uniqlo store is today. And what you see in sort of, the upper half, this is the Hyundai apartments, which was then undergoing construction. Gangnam, in the late 1970s, most of it was farmland. It did not yet exist. It's one of kind of the crowning glories of, mistakes rather of Korean urban planning. But Jun Min-cho was also very much, the way I say he took a lot of these photographs was in contrast to state photography, or state-endorsed photography rather. So the kinds of photographs that were either taken for glossy government brochures or for the National Art Salon, the Sunjeon, they tended to show Seoul in flux, in speed, cars moving very quickly, acceleration of all kinds. This, on the other hand, looks very, very still. It looks like this guy, it almost looks like a diorama. The guy's kind of just tilling his fields. The cow, the ox sort of looks like it's very, very static. And so one question that arises here is whether Jun is taking the picture in anticipation of how future viewers might see this, knowing that this kind of farmland would not exist for much longer. So in other words, is this photograph meant for a viewer that's yet to come rather than the viewer in the present? One way to also kind of think about it is that perhaps this photograph is more realist insofar as it has this very kind of future-oriented perspective. And it's a very different perspective than, say, what in the late 1970s was becoming a general mindset, where the present is always being defined by the future. So you have a very, very, say, high savings rate. So in other words, people sacrificing present pleasures for an unarticulated tomorrow. You have a nation that's constantly defined by future benchmarks. So especially after 1979. So after Korea is awarded the 1988 Seoul Olympics, is always thinking about 5-year plans, about what happens tomorrow. Benchmarks, for example, having a $10,000 per capita income. These sorts of slogans were drilled into, say, people's heads to the extent that the present, again, is completely defined by the future. Now, moving on to a different kind of approach to realism is sort of the proliferation of portraiture. Portraiture has a kind of an interesting history in Korea. A lot of what happened, say, before 1945, lots of, say, self-portraits. A lot of them are very quirky, very distorted. One can perhaps think about it as kind of a sort of a response to late modernism. But I'm bringing up these particular portraits here because they're taking their cues from photography. This is a painter named Kim Hong-joo. Now, Kim Hong-joo is someone that is not very well known in Korean art history, probably much less than he should be. Again, one of the underlying sub-themes of my talk is to kind of really think about trying to think about how do we kind of question sort of the established stories or narratives that have been used to talk about Korean art in general. And Kim Hong-joo, a lot of his portraits make use of these drips. So he has a lot of sort of, he takes actual mirrors. So these are mirrors that he sources from flea markets. So these are really kind of ready-mades. He takes out the glass from the mirrors and replaces them with either canvas, but usually more often silk. And he'll usually paint, say, a self-portrait of himself based on a photograph. And after he's done painting that image, he'll take either one of those plastic spray bottles and just kind of spray the surface. So what happens after the oil dries, and he only uses oil. If you use acrylic, it's going to be a complete mess. Is that after it dries, he then lets heavily diluted white paint kind of trickle over the surface. So one approach to thinking about this kind of trickle-down surface is really about making sure that the viewer sees the difference between the object and the image. So in other words, the image it's never the same as the actual person. This is another work that he's done. Again, you see that same sort of trickle-down effect. And this is an actual sort of a woman's, one of those low-standing, it's a freestanding sort of a cabinet that's kind of meant to lie on the kind of stand on the ground, and the woman would sit in front of it and do her makeup. Now, the interesting thing about, say, this particular work, so here he's replaced a mirror and he's done this painting. It looks like a woman. This is actually the artist. So you want dead giveaway, sort of the bottom, sort of half of the face, and also the hand. And so in some ways it's kind of like this weird sort of experiment in cross-dressing, but rather it's also about how do we kind of recuperate the idea of an individual from its role as a citizen. So we're talking about the mid-1970s, relentless sort of emphasis on progress, on sort of development, and it's a society in which one's existence is only validated if you can perform a specific function, if you have some sort of use or utility. And so someone like Kim Hong-joo, with these kinds of works, it's really kind of pushing back against that. Why does everything have to have a use? Why does everything have to have sort of a purpose? Another interesting aspect about this work is that you can see it's a very specific person, but we don't, unless we're told that, yes, it's the artist painting him or herself, we don't know who that person is, but we know that that person is not anonymous. But at the same time, the point is that this person is anonymous, even though the face is sort of magnified, it's right in our space. Again, it's also wanting to keep in mind kind of the new nature of interpersonal relationships when people are brought into very close quarters because they're living in urban environments, and even closer because they're living in those high-rise apartments, in those shoeboxes. But again, the relationship between yourself and your neighbor, it's not necessarily a kind of stable. And this sort of instability or indeterminacy also affects even the closest forms of relationships, such as the family. So, for example, the work on that you see here, this is actually not his wife, but everybody reads it as such. And this is also this is something that Kim Hong-joo actually anticipated, that people would think of this woman as his wife. This is actually his daughter on the right. But the work, one of the reasons why I'm kind of putting this work up here is, again, one sort of real issue that doesn't get talked about so much is how is it that one can deal with these new kinds of interpersonal relationships where you're not really a stranger, but you're also not really, say, family as well. That is the project of realism about being bold enough or courageous enough to tackle on this indeterminacy, which was really kind of suppressed or sort of purged from view. Another factor too, or another aspect about this particular painting is that that you see that the panels here, they've been inserted into actual door frames. So 146 by 64. So it's a little bit smaller than an actual door, but if you these are the kinds of frames that would be readily available in flea markets at this time. And it's important that the frame is taken into consideration because, again, Kim Hong-joo is really interested in, say, how is it that looking is always mediated by something else, whether it be, say, the frames of a door or, say, how others see others through, say, a mirror or, say, a camera. So is it possible to think about seeing other than something that's other than, say, the paradigm of truth, which is the way realism sometimes gets talked about in a Korean context. Another set of paintings. So these are just two examples of a larger series that a different painter, someone named An Chang-hong, did in the early 1980s, really from 1979. And they're all called Family Picture, and they're all based on actual photographs. So what he would do is take photographs that initially they were photographs that were taken of his own family, but later sourced from, say, flea markets or just sourced from other sorts of archives or other people. Is that he would repaint that image and then go over that painted image with either the end of a blade, sometimes of knife blade or sometimes of scissors, and have a go at the surface, right? So in some ways the logic is quite comparable to Kim Hong-joo, where again you're thinking about how mediated everything is. That if one is to think about realism, one also has to kind of recognize it as sort of an ethical commitment not to give into kind of easy simplifications or easy sorts of essentializations. the other aspect about these photographs, again, it looks like he just took a gun to it and just shot, shot either of these images up to oblivion. But he's also very much very committed to thinking about how the photograph as an image is always subject to some kind of alteration or destruction. So the idea of record keeping or archives or documentation will always be subject to some kind of mutilation or some kind of intervention. This is also a theme that comes across with Sung Neung-kyung's work. So this is a series of black and white photographs. It's called At the Scene. It's from 1979. And what these are is what Sung Neung-kyung did. So Sung Neung-kyung is an artist who was very much affiliated with what was called experimental art in Korea in the 1960s and 70s. And what he's done here was he's taken newspaper photographs that you would see in a newspaper and which had, say, markings of some kind. So not necessarily markings made in a criminal context, but often newspaper photographs meant to illustrate some kind of incident. So, for example, was it right here? This accompanies a larger article of how a building kind of collapsed. I'm sorry if this makes this gets too close to the very unfortunate incident which took place in Hong Kong not too long ago. Or say this refers to a burglary incident in which someone allegedly robbed someone in this Ferris wheel carriage, and they got off at this point. And so he amassed all these photographs, and what he would do was re-photograph every image, blow them up, and then on the negative of that blown up image, he would take ink and he would make his own kind of indication, or all of which was quite arbitrary. But then when those negatives were then developed, they would show up as these kinds of white lines. And these sorts of images, again, kind of indicate the question of, say, how the power of selection is as important as, say, the power of inclusion or choosing what to leave out. That one might also see it as kind of a veiled reaction to the kind of authority that the press had, even in a time when, say, censorship was at its height. It's also in some ways a testament to the kind of power that, say, civilians had to a certain extent. Now, one sort of question to also think about with Sung Neung-kyung is that it's also interesting to think about how artists that are most invested in thinking about reality or, say, realism are those that have been systematically ignored by the so-called avant-garde. So when you think about, say, histories of Korean art, it tends to focus on the avant-garde. I'm guilty of this myself, tansekwa, installation art, what have you. But it's also equally important to note the backgrounds of the artists who rejected that idea of the avant-garde, Sung Neung-kyung being one of them. Sung Neung-kyung was a member of the ST group, most famous for promoting installation and performance in Korea in the early 1970s, and he actively said, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore. This is kind of crystallizing into a clique that I don't want to be part of. Another Sung Neung-kyung work, so along the lines of the question of different sources of power or authority. So this is a much expanded version of the work that we just saw. This is called At the Scene 24. Korean television programs, newspapers love putting 24. It gives kind of this illusion of being present at all times. And here what you have is, again, that's those similar photographs, but now they're just a lot of them, right? So they're all scattered along the wall. They go up kind of on the sides. There's some on the ceiling, which fortunately I was not able to get a shot of. And then you have them just all over the floor. So two things that we might think about in relation to this image, this work is, again, one, how what we think about as real or as true is always going to be unstable. They're just images lying on the ground. They're just scattered. They're just waiting to be put in order or into an order that we would consider legible, even if that legibility has very little to do with actuality or how things really are. Another kind of ex-experimental artist, and I'm using experimental artist quite loosely here, is Shin Hak-chol. So Shin Hak-chol was also a colleague of Sung Neung-kyung. And he was also someone that was very much not really kind of keen on this idea of the avant-garde. So he talks a lot about what is this obsession with being first. I don't want to put myself in that rat race. So if one were to kind of launch a public refusal of experimental art, this is pretty much as good as it gets, right? So it's highly figurative. I mean, it's overwhelming with all kinds of details. And for him, experimental art making, for him it felt a little bit inadequate as a means of addressing the social world around him. But he was also, like Sung Neung-kyung, very interested in the way that approaches to looking were very much mediated by television or, say, televisual culture. So the images that you see here, most of them are actually taken from stills of images that happen to be televised or filmed, for example. So the image that you see here on the top of this couple kissing, this is from a very, very well-known film in the early 1980s. A lot of the faces of the people that you see here. So here you have two torsos stabbing each other. Again, representative of the North-South conflict, again, stabbing each other in the gut. You have a large wheel of a Yamaha motorcycle. You have, say, people just crammed in all sort of nooks and crannies. You have it's difficult to see here, but you see, again, different sorts of images recalling various protest movements, from peasant revolts to labor union protests. And then you have, say, again, people from all walks of life kind of crammed in together. But and one can talk a great deal about, say, the iconography, so where all these images come from. But what's really most interesting is this possibility of anarchic disruption. So again, this is a very sort of unwieldy column. It looks like it might topple at any kind of given moment. The scale is massive, so this is again gives you an idea of sort of how large it was, and. And so this is, this gives you sort of a better look at its detail. So here, for example, this is an image of one of the reunions that took place between South Koreans and their North Korean relatives. Again, you have, say, bodies that are turned into these cyborgian-like sort of tanks or sort of military apparatus. But all of this might feel, say, a little bit overwhelming, but in many ways it was more in tune with the sensation of feeling overwhelmed that was very much central to how everyday life happened to be at this particular time. There are just too many histories, too many lineages, too many ways of processing and projecting information. Another shift that one sees more and more, say, in, I'd say, the actually really early 1980s to mid 1980s is how artists treat popular culture as central to the project of art as social critique. Pop art never had a footing in Korea really until at this time. One reason being is in order to have pop art, you have to have an industrialized society of some kind. That didn't really kind of come to fruition in Korea until really the early to mid 1980s. The work you see here is by an artist named Son Ik-hwan. So it's an oil-on-canvas painting. And one of the questions that these sorts of works raises is to what use are these works, or how does one put the language of popular culture to use? See, here you got sort of the overly saturated, fluorescent greens. You got sort of this blue that was very much typical of soft drink advertisements at this time. You have, say, this military boot sort of suspended from nowhere, and then you have these paratroopers just kind of parachuting down into the land. So very typical kind of scene of military exercises in the countryside, very common even today. And then you have the title of those works, so it's ta 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 ta. This is an onomatopoeia for a machine gun fire. And it's rendered in this kind of bright orange pigment, and the typeface that it uses. This is also a typeface that was almost exclusively used for consumer products. You would never see this typeface for any kind of, say, government slogan or any kind of official document. This is, again, typefaces that are brought in from the language of popular culture. Now, all of these references to advertising, again, one way to think about it is how does this thematize the experience of looking as an everyday practice? So usually you see advertisements in a blur. People have shorter attention spans. I teach at a public university and they say, students, 20 seconds is the max. It's like if you can't get your information in 20 seconds, you've lost them. But those sorts of attenuated attention spans become more and more a reality of how people kind of think about everyday life. Things are more demanding. You see that the colors are very loud, they're very bold, they're all clamor for your attention. So attention becomes an increasingly limited resource. Another work in a similar vein would be this work by Oh Yoon. It's called Marketing 5. So again, it was part of a series. It's called Hell. It's from 1981. And this part, what you see here is you see all kinds of brands recontextualized in Buddhist hell, right? So you have Coca-Cola right here. You got, say, an advertisement that says "drink up," and then you have people kind of chained to this demon right here. You got people being executed in the usual sort of a panoply of grim tortures. You have another advertisement for ice cream says "eat this," right? So it has many connotations. More Coca-Cola again. So one way to think about this is by fusing ads with, say, Buddhism. So Buddhism is a religion that's considered very populist. Even today, there are certain class divides that are tracked based on what religion do you believe in, Buddhism, Catholicism, and Protestantism being sort of the main three. By fusing ads with Buddhism, or by resituating the world of, say, capital production into this other completely different world, is Oh Yoon trying to relativize the dominance of capitalism, which, again, really comes to the fore in the early 1980s. And, you might think to yourself that's a very utopian way of looking at the world. Oh Yoon is probably the most idealist of any Korean artist of his time. And he was also very invested in trying to carve out a place for religion into a longer history of art. And this was considered, this is even more than, say, any project of social critique. This is probably the most provocative thing he could do, given how firmly secular the idea of modernism was, not only in Korea, but, say, in other parts of the world. Now, we come to another kind of key event, and I'm bringing up this event with a little bit of trepidation, mainly because, again, when we think about histories of art, we tend to peg them or think about them as allegories of some sort of larger political occurrence. But one of my interests is really to kind of think about how can the history of art be parallel and also be separate from these sorts of longer political timelines. But having said that, what we're seeing here are images taken, some of the very, very few images that were taken of the Gwangju massacre, or sometimes known as the Gwangju uprising. It's an uprising that took place after Park Chung-hee was assassinated by one of his own men, 1979, and after someone more evil and more stupid named Chun Doo-hwan takes power. It is called, Chun Doo-hwan is to blame for many, many things in Korean society, one of which is poor urban planning, but it's a little bit aside the point. The Gwangju massacre is often called the May 18th incident, just like Tiananmen is sometimes called the June 4th incident. And what happens when Chun Doo-hwan takes power is that he declares martial law. And this, of course, provokes massive uprisings because, again, if you're living in a country that's been under martial law for 7 years, the last thing anyone wants is more martial law, right? And the uprisings are particularly sort of acute in Cholla province, which is it's the province in southwest Korea, and it has been traditionally impoverished and sort of underdeveloped. So when Park Chung-hee was president, he deliberately diverted resources to Gyeongsang province, which is in the southeastern part of Korea, where Busan is. And again, very little in the way of resources was devoted to Cholla province. In fact, the Gwangju Biennial, or Biennale, was established almost as a form of compensation. Say, okay, we know you've been kind of impoverished and sort of marginalized. Here, you can have a very well-endowed Biennale as kind of as compensation. people today there are not really kind of sold on that particular idea, which I'm sure Michelle can talk about in a little bit. But back to in terms of the uprising, so we had hundreds, but really thousands of people died or were injured. And of course, as all good fascist states do, they blame it on communism. Oh, communist sympathizers, kindled this uprising. But what became a really kind of a major milestone, mainly one because it triggered pro-democracy protests all over the country. Another reason that probably really deserves more discussion is the emphasis it put, or the urgency that it imposed on visuality or visualization. If you try to see any sort of foreign magazine that covers the Gwangju uprising, you will not see a single picture. Chunduwan had them blacked out. In Newsweek, for example, if you open up the May 1980 issue, you'll just see a blank space. These are some of really, most of the photographs that were taken of the massacre were clandestine photographs, sometimes taken by journalists such as Na Gyung-taek, but also by just amateur photographers like Shin Mok-jin on the right. And so what the Gwangju Biennale did was it really put new emphasis on the idea of archives or producing records. And it also gave photography new prestige, or it made it more prominent as a political instrument. And so painting also kind of takes its cues from this. You start to have more and more painters paint as if they too were building an archive, becoming much more detailed, for example. Here we see a work by Lee Jong-gu. So Lee Jong-gu here is, again, a lot of, so these works are, I mean, I hate to use labels, but hyper-realist. And there's a sort of lot of attention paid to, again, sort of, the folds of her clothing, sort of the weeds that she's pulling. These are all painted on rice sacks. Another example would be from Gobu to Yoido. This is in reference to a very well-known farmers' protest, where you had thousands of farmers literally traveling from one end of the country all the way to Seoul to protest U.S. imports of cheap rice. So what happened is that in exchange for U.S. aid, the South Korean government said, okay, U.S. farmers, go dump your surplus rice in our economy. What that's going to do is drive down the price of rice. And you had all of these farmers who, again, we're not so pleased with this. And so Lee Jong-gu today is kind of known as a guy who paints a lot of farmers, but really one of the real sort of key contributions he makes is this idea of how do we kind of slow down the pace of attention? How do we get people to pay closer attention to the small details that matter rather than some kind of larger epic narrative? Another important aspect about this focus on the farmer is that he is very interested in representing the figure of the greatest marginalization in a society that privileges urban industrial elites. And so it's one of the reasons why you see the farmer repeated over and over again. Just in case you thought that ink painting died and went away, it did not. This is a work by Kim Ho-seok, one of Lee Jong-gu's friends from Hongik University. And I'm bringing up this up here not necessarily because it's a depiction of a very well-known event, so in this case, a funeral of a pro-democracy protester, but really about how you can have an ideology. So you can have some kind of belief or some kind of mission that might motivate the creation of a work, but how that ideology is molded or how that belief is formed can result in something very, very different when it's visualized. For example, here is, this is actually a detail from the sister work to March of History, 1993, is that you see these large ink blots. So as a narrative device, it means tear gas, it means sort of, smoke, it means, it's convincing as an image of, say, tear gas or smoke or protest, but it also really compromises the legibility of this particular scene because of how large it is. You know, it's just kind of spread all over the surface. And again, one of the other interests that someone like Kim Ho-seok has, someone who is very much interested in preserving the independence of art, because he's saying that, you know, if art tries to pretend like it's doing social work, it's not going to do much at all. You know, one has to think about what is it about, how is it that artworks can make one think about the visual and about form in a way that would subsequently then have some kind of political implication. A lot of these works are grouped under the rubric of Minjung art. Minjung refers to a collective effort among intellectuals between 1971 and 1988, although there's a case to be made for Minjung as predating this. It's usually a politics of representation. So again, we saw lots of angry farmers, protests, what have you. But another really kind of key concept to think about, especially with regard to art, are the generational divides. So, and this is something I can't stress enough when it comes to thinking about histories of Korean art, is the photographers that we saw. They're born in the 1920s and 30s when their, say, view of the world is shaped by the Korean War, by, say, the colonization of Korea and Japan. Those who were born in the 1940s, like Kim Hong-joo, for example, it is shaped by the anti-President Lee Seung-man re-protests, so the coup d'etat of 1960. Now, Minjung artists, the majority are born in the 1950s. When they come of age, when you have, say, hippie culture, when you have, say, the refusal of tradition, but they're also the first generation to live in nuclear families, in apartments, in heavily urbanized spaces. And it's also a generation that failed to secure any real sort of political place. There was no sort of large coup to resist. There was no sort of, other than, say, the Gwangju uprising, but the vast majority of Minjung artists are based in Seoul. They're not based in Gwangju. There's none of the heroics that are involved or associated with earlier generations, and many of them are too young to remember them. So this is also something to really kind of take into consideration. Now, when paired with art, the Minjung kind of becomes an attempt to bring in what was sort of shadowy and just sort of implied into a conversation previously dominated by artists, critics, and the figure of the viewer. In short, it is an attempt to bring in the idea of the public. Now, by public, I mean something very different from the audience. When you think about audiences, we can talk about taste, we can talk about demographics, but the public here refers to a particular idea and not a flesh and blood thing. So what was it? So Minjung, it was never really specifically defined. In English, it's often translated as the people, but it's one way to think about it is what it is not. One is the inmin. So the inmin means the popular, it's used to refer to people in North Korea. It's a term that is specifically associated with communism. Again, those of you who speak Chinese will know renmin, inmin, very similar sort of resonance. It is different from, say, the Pyeongmin. Pyeongmin is a class term. It means commoner. Well, loosely translated, it means commoner, but it is a class marker. It refers to a feudal society. And then at the very end is Daejung, which is really a word that is used almost exclusively in the context of taste, popular taste, common taste, mass appeal. And so Minjung is quite different from all of these three, although it does have certain kinds of resonances with all these terms. Now, one important contribution that Minjung art did make was to emphasize how art making is just a process among many. So one of the arguments it's trying to make is that it's contiguous with any other kind of any kind of gesture, that there's no difference between art and the world outside. This is emblematized in the many murals that were painted, mostly on university campuses. This is the former main library of Yonsei, giant mural. And then this is on the law school of Gyeonggi University, also in Seoul. But the one thing that these murals also remind us is how realism becomes a question very much rooted in thinking about what interests and purposes does this kind of art serve. And it's no longer based on skill. It's no longer based on, say, technique or even access to certain kinds of knowledge, but it's really on hopes of for whom art could serve and how. And this is where the art / say life balance kind of tips over into the latter, that art seems increasingly determined by artists' desire to intervene in actual life. Probably the exemplar of this is the many woodcuts that were produced. Lots of people turn to woodcuts. It's like, woodcuts are sort of like the official visual idiom of any revolution. You have this, of course, and Lu Xun is probably the poster child for this. It's easily made, it's reproducible, it's distributable, it involves collaborations, cooperation. I mean, it's just kind of that perfect medium. But the woodcut, say, in the Korean context also kind of brings up the question of how feelings can be political. But here what you have is, so you have here woodcut of a miner kind of eating his humble ration, and this is actually on a file, on one of the many files that were taken of laborers that were indentured at this time. And then what you have here on the right is an angry student protester with a Molotov cocktail about to kind of do some serious damage. Now, both of these works, again, they're also very deeply pessimistic because here what you have is a sense of the world that is dead because the only emotions that are available to you or viable at this time are despair, rage, and sorrow. And so what you get is you have this strong emotional reaction that makes one's position very uncertain, but one also has to kind of come to grips with that uncertainty to kind of result in any real change. Another way of thinking, or a way of looking at woodcuts is the appeal to folk art. So what we have here is Oh Yoon's Song of the Sword from 1985, and it's taking its cue from many of the folk woodcuts that were again cheap and very readily available. So an example of what you see here on the right. Now, this kind of reference to, say, vernacular culture was very, very popular. Again, lots of connotations of idiom and dialect, so things that were considered outside of the mainstream, that were unofficial, that were not considered avant-garde. Let's see. And I know we're running short on time. I do want to, there are 3 more images I didn't want to show. Okay. So. Now, one question that many of you might be asking is, well, did all of this, say, these images get any of these artists in trouble? What were sort of the political implications of this? The emblem of all of that might be Shin Hak-chol's Planting Rice from 1979. So Min-jung artists did make the state very nervous because it showed how art could have political intention. But the state was very cunning because on the one hand, Min-jung was all about, say, again, trying to make visual images accessible by being as literal as possible, right? But what you have here is sort of this large painting that Shin Hak-chol draws, and you have sort of these farmers, you got sort of this mass of consumer goods, cigarettes, you got military warheads, a frightened Uncle Sam clinging on to dear life, you got Coca-Cola, and then you have, say, sort of these farmers sort of hanging out, and then these mountains and lots of fruit. Now, the state, it was shown in 1987 at one of the more important Min-jung exhibitions, and when it was shown, Shin Hak-chol got a very nasty little call from the prosecutor's office saying this is a reactionary work and it violates the national security law. So, as with all good authoritarian countries, is that you need to have a big, nice blanket law that you can just accuse anyone of anything, right? And so he was arrested for violating this law, and because it was not only, and the justification. Oh, whoops. The justification was that these happy farmers here were in the upper half of the painting, so they were reading this work as a metaphor of the Korean peninsula. So all of this stuff right here, again, elusive of South Korea, and this is North Korea. And because Shin Hak-chol had actually come out and said, oh, this is supposed to be Mount Baekdu, so tallest mountain in Korea on the border between Korea and China. It was very, very literally read. And on the one hand, we might think, oh, you know, these lawyers, they're ridiculously stupid. No, they were trying to make this into sort of a show trial, right? Saying, you know what, okay, Min-jung people, if you're going to be literal, we can be just as literal as you. And so during the actual deposition, when Shin Hak-chol had to kind of give testimony about this work, he said that, well, actually, you know, all of this, these products here about, say, military warheads and also consumerism, this is blocking my dream of unification. And he was acquitted because of that statement, because he said the magic word, unification. Nationalism always rules, right? But the story doesn't stop there, because in 1999, he was tried for the same offense. Double jeopardy exists in Korea, believe it or not. And at this point, the state actually, they actually did end up prosecuting him. But the interesting thing of the way that the state decided to punish Shin Hak-chol was not to put him in prison or give him a fine, because what that would do would basically make him a martyr, right? It would just basically be saying, hey, you know, so, we've arrested one of the Min-jung artists, and what we're going to do is to destroy his work. But they didn't destroy it intentionally. What happened was, okay, Shin Hak-chol, why don't you explain what this work means to us again? And so most Min-jung works are not made on, say, high-quality materials. A lot of that is deliberate. And so when the canvas was unrolled constantly, just in this sort of back and forth, is that the painting eventually deteriorated and just kind of disappeared. So in some ways, it was a really kind of clever move on the part of the state, is because it was destroyed in the name of due process, right? That in the name of inspecting legal evidence, the work was gone, right? Now, 2 more works, and we can adjourn. Now, one of the other kind of great contribution Min-jung has made is to really kind of put judgment as an important theme. So many of these works seem to be reflecting ideology, but few don't really have much to offer after all the speculations are made. The artists that really stand out among the Min-jung are the ones who don't try and reduce reader experience to the same status as attention. In other words, the artists that are, say, most intriguing or compelling are the ones that actually leave room for the artwork to generate its own experiences. One example might be this work by An Gyu-chol. It's probably the most anomalous of any work classified as Min-jung. It is a little gypsum model. So it's made of the same material that one would use to make, very similar to the material that you would use to make claymation, claymation figures, with Play-Doh or what have you. And here we have a rendition of the U.S. ambassador's residence in Seoul. So it's guarded by 2 faceless security guards, a blue door, some trees, and the U.S. flag, just in case you forgot where you were. And then on the side, you got this figure right here, right, scaling the wall. So again, this is an allusion to the many attempts by, say, student activists to scale the U.S. embassy walls or the ambassador's walls. But it's been redone as this kind of almost kitschy, cute, even almost sort of, naive particular work. Not surprisingly, it's been completely suppressed or omitted from any history of art, including the history of Min-jung art. But again, it's also a way in which, say, how form and ideology don't necessarily go hand in hand in the way that one might expect. That the second point that relates to this is, again, Min-jung art is very deadly earnest. It's very, very serious. But this particular work opens up, say, room for parody or mockery, which implies an ability on the part of the viewer to kind of be able to make a separation between what's taking place versus how you're experiencing a particular situation. And not a lot of Min-jung works do that. A lot of Min-jung works assume that the viewer is some kind of, say, dumbed down, illiterate person who needs everything spelled out. And so this is another way of thinking about how do we think about the viewer in a more sophisticated way, that we just don't assume that the viewer is objective or reasonable or, say, illiterate. And so the last work I wanted to bring up today is a collage by Bul-ddong. And with Bul-ddong's work, one of the interesting things is, again, it's a juxtaposition of different, say, photographed images. So you have, say, riot police right here, lots and lots of money of all kinds of currencies. Magazines of bullets, bricks. You got the U.S. flag. You have manicured fingers. You got part of the earth. So you have all of these different sorts of sort of images put together. But one, it gets you thinking about, say, objects and materials from where, not only from where they come from, but how their use is determined by, say, different dynamics of production or consumption. Another is, you notice that how everything kind of is configured into a sort of shrine-like form. So how is it that martial culture, so these riot police, for example, how does the culture of imminent war frame the possibility of belief in 1980s Korea? So what Park Bul-ddong is getting at here is how is it that the religion and the secular how do they coexist in a single moment, and how do we admit both have their own claims to realness or reality? Another point to make about this work is that no perpetrator is defined. So he's not necessarily assigning blame. These works don't necessarily have an explanation. And this is one of the more kind of powerful, more important points to think about Park Bul-ddong's work is the refusal to make clear any kind of polemical position that would feed into that kind of unusually binaristic mindset of us versus them, state versus us. So it's a real kind of way to separate oneself from sort of the Min-jung party line. And I promise this is the last work. For Park Bul-ddong, critique is kind of a moot point at this point. The battle is already lost. Capitalism has won. The military has won. But again, going back to what is sort of the role of humor, or is that, it's kind of funny. It's just you have sort of, Miss Korea pageant contestants in a row. You got a guy with a inverted diamond as a hat. You have, money mixed with, say, sausage. Again, similar sorts of juxtaposition taking place here with, say, extracted images of models meeting, say, a guy sort of picking his teeth in a cabbage patch. So you have, again, all of these different sorts of images that are brought together. But what he's really getting at here is that we don't have aspiration anymore. There's nothing to aspire to. And the tragic earnestness and the catastrophe that was evident in so much 1980s Min-jung art is just kind of embarrassing and dated by 1992. I mean, it's, again, you can't imagine angry farmers really having the same resonance as 1992 as you might have had, say, 10 years earlier. And so the very last point I want to make is the fate of mass societies. Park Bul-ddong is saying that that fate has to be approached differently. So in place of aspiration, we have to make do. So instead of, it can't be any better than this, now we have, it could be worse. And so all you can do is sort of kind of sit back and smirk at the spectacle that is unfolding over which you may or may not have full control. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan, for a very visually rich and also very entertaining talk, I have to say. And I was just told that actually Joan did the first talk at AAA ever, maybe 15 years ago.
I'm 19 though.
So it's a great pleasure to have you back again. And I will keep this very brief and short. So as we were going through a lot of these works, what I was kind of making notes and thinking of is that these are actually works that are very intimate, that are in a certain way very removed from the political reality in South Korea at the time. And then just as I was writing this, the Gwangju slide came up. So I was like, okay, maybe not. But what kind of really stuck with me was how the work that you've chosen to discuss at this for this talk, they actually are all mediated, either through photography, through lens, or through what we're looking at, collages, or through the materiality. And I wonder if you can elaborate it a little on that.
So I think, well, so those of you familiar with Korean art history might think that this is a little bit kind of unorthodox in, for example, the kinds of works that you've seen here that are presented to represent Min-jung. But I think one of the real kind of strengths about a lot of these artists, again, is their ability to recognize that the difference between, say, an image versus something that actually happens versus something that could take place in the future. So not being able to recognize this, or collapsing all of this or thinking of that all of them are the same, this is a kind of what might be considered a flaw in the Min-jung project, because one of the sort of ironies of Min-jung is that oftentimes it reproduces this very same logic that it purports to resist. So the state is all about suppressing certain kinds of histories or certain ways of looking at the world. Well, Min-jung also does the same. So one thing that we were talking about a little bit earlier before was one of the suppressed histories is that a lot of Minjung artists are deeply misogynistic. There is not a single female artist I mentioned. Some of you might have noticed that, and that's not surprising at all. Given the extent to which women in Minjung art really only exist as objects, as, say, a narrative element, so images of, say, female seamstresses being locked in, locked in an office and set on fire. It's one of the more canonical Minjung works. But there's really very little in the way of, well, how do we reconcile sort of this misogyny, and also how do we reconcile the difference between the fact that all of these Minjung artists come from elite backgrounds. So, for example, with Oh Yoon's work. Oh Yoon is the son of a very well-known novelist, and again, he's also purporting to make work for the masses. But at the same time, you start to think about, well, again, there's very little literature that tries to kind of reconcile between those two. Back in terms of the question of, say, mediation, well, part of that, I think, is also to preserve the autonomy of artworks. So again, being able to recognize that art is not the same thing as, say, social work or going out into the streets. I think some Minjung artists are better at, say, recognizing that distinction than others, and they make that very, very visible in their work.
Which leads me to another thought that I was thinking about, which is that you mentioned this quite a number of times in your presentation, is that the Minjung artists, or the artists that you spoke to us about today, a lot of their works is about that future, that potential of either of a different life, or a unified nation. Mm-hmm. But these are potential, these are not realized. So in a way, these works speaks of a grammar of mm-hmm. the future, which, is very, very different from, I think, nowadays what you look at if it's in South Korea now, or they are very much, or in Gwangju specifically, that they are very much about writing that history, writing a particular narrative, and in a way it's very much state imposed as well. And I wonder what your thoughts are.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think a lot of that sort of interest in the future is what makes a lot of these works relevant to a particular contemporary. So, as you mentioned, especially until about the early 1990s, your entire everyday world was defined by what might take place, not what would take place, but what would take place, not just next year, but 15 or 20 years down the line. Today, it's that duration has become even greater. So when you have, say, younger artists working in Korea now, they're making works about cyborgs or robots or going out of into outer space. Science fiction is very, very popular among younger Korean artists, but at this time, the time spans that we're thinking about are really, say, 10 or 15 years into the present, and that sense of time is still very much determined by state, or actually corporate determined benchmarks. 15-year plans, 10-year plans, projected goals. I used to work as a corporate lawyer, so this was my entire life. Maybe I'm a little bit more biased than I should be. But the way that, say, people are thinking about time as, say, this constant series of projections, I think that is also what made these works particularly relevant to the moment in which they were made.
I have a lot more questions, but I thought instead of hogging the mic, it might be nice to open it up to question and answer. So if there's any questions coming from the floor, please be our guest.
Hello. Also, I think just because of the timeline, I know we also have a lunch we promised you, and we do have it indeed. If there are maybe like 1 or 2 burning questions, and then have a casual Q&A over lunch.
There's a question from Hamad.
Thank you, Joan. And one of the things that struck me, and I'd love to get an expansion from you on it, was just around ideas of time. And I think one of the things that you touched upon was the time of art and the time of life. And given that range that you've looked at from the 50s to the 90s, I wonder if you see some differential in that relationship.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important question. One is because one of the it's an important question for two reasons. One is the question is all about how do we not make art just serve as an illustration or an allegory of politics. I think that's one of the reasons why it's important. But the difficulty or challenge of that question is then if that's the case, if we think art has its own separate time, by what are sort of the measures by which that time will be configured? And so one way to, so the way that I've done it here is admittedly very crude. I've done it in terms of, say, media, different kinds of medium or different sorts of themes that artists are looking at. But I do think it could be also thought about in terms of series of related questions or problems. So for example, yeah, so for example, with the kind of the shift from this sort of work, which is almost usually associated with, say, the Gwangju massacre. One of the reasons why I paired it with, say, thinking how artists are thinking about the language of popular culture is because both are looking at, say, or both are the problems that they're most concerned with is about how to think about the way that people see the world or how do they envision the world. So one way to kind of think about an alternative timeline for art is, again, what are sort of the concerns that artists are grappling with in terms of their own respective practices, rather than how is it that how does this artwork kind of fit into these larger political timelines based on kind of these cataclysmic events? So, thank you.
Any other questions? Burning questions? Okay, well, if there aren't any, there's one.
If one's talking about time, I think one also needs to talk about geography. And the references you only made were kind of internal to Korea. And it seemed to me, I mean, the early photography, one's thinking about Cartier-Bresson and Verite. In the big stack of Korean society, that painting, Jose Clemente Orozco is screaming out. And there's both an Buddhism, there's an embrace and an avoidance, it seems, of Chinese socialist realism. I mean, the woodblock movement, obviously, but then the peasant painting movement of the late 60s and 70s obviously comes up. So I'm just wondering, how the artists themselves felt about this, and did they avoid it, mentioning it, or did they embrace it? Because, of course, it's all very ideologically charged.
Yep, no, it's exactly right. And were I to go into all the other references, we'd be here all day, which I'm fine with, but maybe others are not. The Cartier-Bresson reference is absolutely on point. Cartier-Bresson was Lee Mung-sik's favorite photographer. So the idea of sort of the slice of life image, that was, that again was kind of the hallmark that, so Lee Mung-sik was also an educator, and the Cartier-Bresson, so the decisive moment, that was something that was repeated endlessly. Again, another point of reference would be the Family of Man exhibition. So if many of these works seem very kind of focused on, say, local concerns or concerns that are specifically associated to a very particular part of Korea, it's also, again, thinking about how is it that Korea might be able to fit into this larger kind of, frankly, idealistic view of humanity. In terms of, say, the Orozco reference, so the work that I showed was Oh Yoon, for example. There's an earlier work that he did that takes its cues from Rivera, actually. And that's a work that doesn't exist today. It was made in 1969. Some people think of it as the first real sort of Minjung work. It was ended up being destroyed by the state as usual because it looked too North Korean, or at least what the state considered to be North Korean, which in retrospect is just kind of the catch-all excuse. You're not going to be able to argue with an authoritarian state that says, oh, it's too communist. Nationalism might be the only way you can kind of save yourself. In terms of, say, other references in terms of Chinese socialist realism. So the woodcuts that we saw, so Lu Xun was certainly someone who was referenced. But in terms of, say, the works that do seemed to take its cues from socialist realism. It was actually Soviet socialist realism that they were looking at. In 1983, the first major exhibition of Soviet socialist realism took place in Seoul. And so lots and lots of artists tended to congregate around that show. They produced pamphlets, they produced, held discussions about Soviet socialist realism and its own kinds of claims to idealism. Chinese socialist realism really only came into the picture after really the early 1990s, so after diplomatic relations between South Korea and China made exhibitions and the transfer of information more readily possible. But great question, thank you.